What's up, everybody? And we are going to continue the 27 plot point outline breakdown. We are ultimately breaking down each plot point of the outlining process. You might also know it as the 27 chapter outline, but today is all about plot point 22. So let's just jump right into it. If you don't know, this is also starting section 8, and it is the first plot point in that section. And we are in Act 3, the middle of Act 3. With that said, plot point 22 is all about your character having hit rock bottom in plot point 21, but the protagonists themselves are finding the power within to succeed, thus, power within. Now, if you don't know, we're going to tackle 4 subject ideas within this plot point, and renewed energy is the first one. You know, if you don't know, as every section has a beginning, middle, and end, PP22 is indeed the first plot point of section 8, which means the narrative needs to reestablish the new status quo of your protagonists and their circumstances. Remember, every beginning plot point needs to set up what's to come. It doesn't have to be specific, it just needs to have enough clarity for the reader to understand where they're going, but more importantly, where they currently are. Basically, you're establishing the emotional, mental, physical, spiritual, whatever element of their circumstances. It could be one or more of those things. They could just be in a mental state. They could be in an emotional state. They could be in a mental emotional state. They could be in a spiritual state. The point is, the reader needs to understand where the characters are starting. And since they're going from despair to finding the power within, you want to reestablish how they feel from the previous plot point, but also what is going to move them forward. This is accomplished by simply showing your protagonists in their new internal and external circumstances. Keep in mind that the new status quo is setting up section 8, but also it's setting up the spark within your protagonist. This is when they are ignited with a sense of power, or, as the plot point suggests, the power within. Also, if you don't know, Section 8 is known as the protagonist finds the power. And it's in this plot point where that power begins to form. And since all sections have 3 plot points, remember, you're going to allow that power to develop and strengthen over the course of the next 3 plot points. To be fair and clear, a plot point does not necessarily mean a chapter, though a chapter can supply the needs of a single plot point. But depending on your genre and all the other elements, you can have more than one chapter in a plot point. All right. With that said, remember, it's resolve the problem caused by the midpoint conflict. All right. So the protagonist, A, has found the inner strength within, but that inner strength is specifically there to resolve the problem caused by the midpoint conflict. This inner strength is important for fueling your protagonist with renewed determination to fight back. Remember, in the end of Act 2, right, they were going into Act 3 with pure determination. They were willing to fail because they were going to try to succeed whether they died or not. Then the beginning of Act 3, which is plot point 19, 20, and 21, puts them into a sense of despair and the lack of hope and taking away that determination. This plot point 22, is reestablishing that determination. So wherever your character was in the previous plot point, they are now finding the will, the determination. By the way, both the narrative and your protagonist need that renewed determination to fight back for many reasons. However, and of course, if you don't know by now, this renewed energy also gives hope to the reader and, of course, your protagonist. It lifts the narrative into a sense of possibility. Sure, will they, won't they is still on the table and should be. But ultimately, you have to remember something very important here, okay? You need that spark to light the fire of interest and excitement within the character themselves, but hopefully it's doing the same to your reader. So, yeah, the reader must feel like there's a sense that they could fail or they could succeed. They are highly capable of doing either. They are highly capable of succeeding, but there's still that chance they might not succeed because they're in over their head in Act 3. Remember, Act 3 is putting them in a world they don't understand, whether that circumstance is a new feeling, a new emotional, mental, physical, or spiritual circumstance. However, we know that our character is capable of finding solutions, is capable of breaking through, is capable, but that doesn't mean it's guaranteed. Act 1, whatever they're capable of, they're guaranteed to succeed. Act 2, it's like 75-25. They have the ability, they're more likely than not going to succeed, but there's that small chance they're either going to have to adapt or die, right? But Act 3, it's feels like 50-50, but sometimes it feels like 25-75, depending on how you're trying to create the tension. Bum, bum, bum. And remember, tension is basically setting up stakes and then the time it takes to resolve the stakes and ultimately say, hey, those stakes have been we've made it through the stakes. What does that look like? Well, I'm late for work, and if I don't get there on time, I'm going to be fired. Stakes have been set. The drive to work creates the tension. I get to work. I'm a minute before I'm late. The tension is gone, and now we are back to the status quo of the next situation. And that's how tension and stakes work. All right, let's get into it. Number 2, agency. The transition from total defeat and despair to renewed agency. I'm using agency very specifically because your character must have agency. What is agency, though, on the surface level? Choice. Anytime you hear somebody talking about agency, and hopefully they're talking about it correctly, but agency is ultimately that they are making the choices. They are directly influencing the narrative in one way or another, but they are agency is definitely for sure that the character, whether they're failing through the narrative or not, they are making choices. They're the ones that are not being pulled around. They are pulling things around. Okay. So with the transition from total defeat and despair, we are indeed trying to renew that agency. We are giving them a sense of hope because this is the power within. Characters should always have a sense of agency in your narrative. However, it's important that in plot point 22, they absolutely have that agency. What does that mean? Well, sometimes your first act doesn't have a lot of agency with a character, and that's okay. And the reason that is because sometimes they're a character just living their life. They might have low self-esteem or they might not have the gumption to take steps forward. And you know what? The plot is happening around them and pulling them. Why? Well, let's say they live in a house, they can't afford the house, and the house is taken away from them. Then they get to work, and it turns out they don't have money for the car, so the car is taken away from them. So then they're forced to react to it. That isn't necessarily agency, it's just that they're reacting to what's happening in the plot. Agency in those situations might be they start doing stuff to stop people from taking the IRS from taking their car, taking their house, right? That would create agency. What I'm saying is if you have a narrative where your character doesn't have a lot of agency, because that might be narratively important for your story, and that is totally fine. But when they hit plot point 22 in your narrative, they need to have agency. And the reason is because they're doing what they can to fix the issue. Now, let's say you have a negative character arc where they're ultimately going to fail, whatever it is. They have, a tragic virtue or whatever, okay? They would still have the agency in plot point 22, but we know that their agency is going to lead to choices that ultimately have results that are poor. They are failing. So, but they still must make those choices. And it just shows that they're becoming proactive. because the despair was too much, and they're like, no, I'm not going to let despair beat me. We're going to take care of this. So, with that said, it's here in plot point 22. Okay, it's here your protagonists find that power within, and they are choosing to get up, get out, and do what they have to make things happen, to win. They're trying to create victory, right? So they have a deeper willingness to win, knowing they still could fail, but they're willing to put it all in. Also, giving characters agency shows them, the characters, making choices. Characters need to make choices. However, again, if your narrative is more or less that they are not necessarily a highly proactive or they have a lot of agency, that is fine. But I would implore you that plot point 22 is where they show their agency. Plot point 23 is where they take action on that agency. And plot point 24 is going to be where they have results or consequences. Consequences could be good or bad because of that agency. With that said, though, here are 3 elements to keep in mind. Okay? You want to focus on these 3 elements: internal status quo, the spark of hope, and setting the plan. What does that mean? Well, the internal status quo is this is where in the narrative you're going to clarify. You don't have to over clarify. The reader just needs to understand what's going on. You want to go deeper than the physical setting when you're setting the circumstances. We need to reveal the protagonist's current mental state to provide context for their up and coming choices. Okay? The simple version of that is ultimately that the reader needs to understand the clarity of their circumstances and then the internal reasons why they are willing to go above and beyond. Okay? And again, this does not have to be written out verbatim on the page. We just need to understand it as best we can. And sometimes you need a little bit more information, and sometimes you need just the right amount. With that said, this allows us to lead to the spark of hope, and this is your job, is ultimately introducing a sense of possibility. This internal shift within your character reignites not only the reader but the protagonist by signaling that the character is ready to fight back against the midpoint conflict, meaning they realize, wait a minute, yes, my original solution may not have been working, or it was the right solution, but I used it wrong, and now I realize how to use it, and we're going to do it. Well, setting the plan is them ultimately establishing the stakes and specific actions required for the climax. I say specific, but remember, you do not have to unfold every single detail. Specific enough to understand the clarity. A good example of this is how in Oceans 11, 12, and 13, you always know that they're establishing some sort of plan, and they're always working on some sort of plan, and we know that there is a plan, but we don't know the specifics. Not that you have to get as crazy or convoluted as the Oceans movies, but it is important to still establish what is happening. So we know things are happening in the Oceans films. We know that they're getting chips together. We know that they have the dice. They're putting what is it? The metal in the dice, right? And they have to go to the dice factory. We know that in the third one they have to get somebody to feel sick. The Five Diamonds guy, right? We know that they're doing things and we understand they are doing things, but we may not know the complete and specific elements of every aspect of the plan. So when I say use plot point 22 as a moment to establish the stakes, what's to lose, what they have to lose, and the specific actions required for the climax, all I'm saying is establish enough information so the reader understands what they're going to do and where they need to go and what's at stake. What can they lose, right? If they fail, what will they lose, right? Basically, the protagonist moves from being a victim of circumstance to an active participant in your narrative with a clear mission. In other words, agency. Number 3, the turnaround and momentum. Essentially, plot point 22 is the fire that lights the fuse. But what is the fire? What is that fire? Well, plot point 22 is where you, the author, must show it on the page. It's your job to make sure it's quite clear what the motivation is and or what the plan is. The plan, by the way, is what they'll take action on in the next plot point, because the next plot point is literally action to rally. But for now, the reader needs to know what's up. What's up? Does the reader need to know every single detail? No. They just need to understand what's going on. They need to know what's driving the character and where they're going, or will try to go. Because ultimately, the reader needs to know what winning looks like. What is the plan to win? In the Matrix, they're like, hey, Morpheus needs to be rescued. So the plan is we have to go in, we have to rescue him. And what do? Action around, they go back into the Matrix. We need guns. Whoa. Okay. But before then, plot point 22 is ultimately them looking at the circumstances. Do we pull Morpheus out, pull him off the machine is plot point 21. But then they're like, wait a minute, we can do this if we go back in, because he's like, oh, the Oracle said I would have to make a choice between Morpheus and this, and let's do it. So he's realizing the Oracle's words, and he's like, all right, let's do that, blah, blah, blah. I'm going back in. And then Trinity's like, I'm going in with you. It's a very quick scene ultimately, but at the same time, in a book, it would be longer. There would be a lot of more internal development, stuff like that. My point is, we need to know the plan. And finally, pace. If you don't know, pace is the speed at which information is presented to the reader. A slow pace is a lot of information being presented at once. A fast pace is just enough information being presented to keep the narrative going and understanding what's happening. All right. With that said, avoid rushing a protagonist's recovery or giving them immediate victories after they hit rock bottom. What does that mean? It means that they just came from plot point 21, a sense of despair. They can't be up on cloud 9 right away. You have to lead them to that recovery. So remember, you don't have to let everything unfold in one long chapter. A plot point can be more than one chapter, and sometimes should be. Also, it depends on your genre. But depending on your genre, you'll have to make it slower or faster. Faster is like romance. Romance could be a plot point. A chapter could handle a plot point at a time. But epic fantasy, sci-fi, thrillers sometimes could be a little longer here and there. My point is, don't feel like you need to put everything into one chapter. If you have to spread it out and allow it to be earned, do it. In fact, you can take any plot point and turn it into 3 chapters. You ultimately have you set up the plot point, you live within the plot point, and then you resolve the plot point. You could do that. You could do set up in one chapter, and then basically move around and resolve it in another chapter. So you have options. Don't feel like you're restricted to that. But my point is, with this, allow the pace to feel as needed for the genre. If it's going to be a lot of information and you want them to really kind of establish a footing, you might want to slow down the pace and allow it to breathe through 1, 2, 3, or even 4 chapters. If it's very simple, if the plot is simple, and there's nothing wrong with a simple plot, trust me, Star Wars A New Hope is a simple plot. Stop the bad guys, right? Join the rebellion, save the princess, blow up the ship, blow up the Death Star. But in a romance, it could just be, I'm going to get the girl or guy, and I know I have to go to the wedding and stop the wedding. And that's usually what it is. Anyway, with that said, basically, since Section 8 has 3 plot points to play with, use plot point 22 to set up the spark of hope and motivation and the plan, right? Give this specific plot point a chance to set the foundation, the plan, the motivation, etc. And know that you don't have to overdo it and fill in all the details. A lot of newer writers worry about that and they're always like more, more, more. And that's not necessarily the truth. Sometimes it's less, less, less. But to be fair, plot point 22 is known as setup, 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 right? It's here where you lay the foundation for the reader to understand what is happening, what has happening, and what will happen, ultimately the potential for what needs to happen. But that doesn't mean you can't let other information unfold over the next few chapters, and of course, the chapters of PP23 and PP24. Real quick, all that means is you can set the foundation for what needs to happen with the least amount of information, but the reader knows what's going on. And then you could build on that information over the course of the next chapters within plot point 22 or within the chapters of plot point 23 and 24. So that's something to think about. With that said, that's it. Okay. If you have any questions about this lessons or writing in general or your book, let me know in the comments below. All right. Oh, by the way, if you didn't know, you can go to makearightleft.here.com. That's right. I have 3 books available. I have books available. Makearightleft.here.com. You can check them out. I have a book on building narration. So we are talking about this book and this information, a 27 plot point outline. It goes over what narrative is in greater detail than these lessons. And also, the second half of the book is 100% outlining. So it shows you everything you need to know about outlining and gives you real-time examples. If you love epic fantasy, remember Death of a King is currently available on Patreon and Substack. You have to go to the Scribe tier for Patreon. But Substack and Patreon are identical, so whichever one you go to, you're going to get the same stuff. You get the 0, 1st, and 3rd draft before the polish, and you get educational elements. I teach you about what it is I'm doing and my choices within those chapters, and of course, I give a lesson on how to use that information for your own book. If you didn't know, I have book 1 and 2. Book 1 is currently available. Book 2, boom. Oop, that's not it. Boom. I just got the author a copy, and I have to read it and go through it. I'm excited. I hope you're excited. That book will be available soon. This is not the artwork, but the noir is also available on Patreon and Substack. Remember, it is only the 0 draft. However, it is also educational. With that, if you didn't know, you can also join the YouTube membership. Feel free to. What will you get? You get a whole bunch of extra videos, but more importantly, you get my course. The course is how to write a narrative. All right. If you want, Patreon and Substack also have those videos available. But if you don't want to join that and you want to spend a little less money and still support me, you still get the course on the YouTube channel through the membership, and it would mean the world to me. Other than that, remember to bloop that beard and bloop that like button. I'm out. I'm Thomas J. Bellezza, and as always, keep developing the right mindset. I'll see you next time. Bye!